The following video is a review and critique of Disco Elysium, a RPG released by Studio Zorn late last year. I will be going more into detail as to some of the game's mechanics, so if you prefer to play games completely blind, then you shouldn't watch any of this. I have made an attempt to make this review as spoiler-free as possible, but you can never be sure with these, so tread carefully. This review was initially released in a written form available on my blog, so if you'd like to read that instead, it is available in the description below. With that out of the way, please enjoy. I enjoyed playing through Disco Elysium, but for completely different reasons than those that initially sold the game to me. Going in, I believe it would be the type of RPG that I'd been looking for quite some time. One that is not burdened by most of its interaction with the world happening on a grid, scanning through a list of spells and abilities, frantically pausing every frame, trying to min-max numbers as to not get destroyed by a pack of menacing farm animals of a slightly higher level. Samples of that in the genre would be classics such as Baldur's Gate, or newer reiterations like Divinity Original Sin and Shadowrun Hong Kong. What I would habitually find myself doing is picking up the game, sinking my teeth into it, eventually hitting a numerical roadblock in some quest, and almost immediately retiring to a life of not playing that game ever again, as I'm faced with the option of either save scumming and beating my head against the numeric wall until by some fluke of the numbers I got the good number and am allowed to proceed, or could just stop doing whatever thing I'm currently invested in and go somewhere else on the map, where the numbers are not as disagreeable, so I can get my personal numbers high enough to where the numbers I was having difficulty beforehand seem less impressive, and I can pick up that quest again, but this time only halfway through, struggling to remember contextual cues that were relevant perhaps a few hours ago, but are now a forgotten footnote in some journal entry. In both cases, the immersion gives way to the idea of gameplay, as the perhaps flawed ideal of an RPG is that which is based on a tabletop role-playing game such as Dungeons & Dragons or the aforementioned Shadowrun, or anything else that follows the same formula. From my personal experience in tabletop RPGs, the same issue persists, namely in having meaningful choice and character development take second fiddle to massive 3 to 5 man, 1 to 2 hour combat encounters in between the more immersive moments of dialogue between players, non-player characters, or story development. I've always felt that combat is so abstracted from everything else in tabletop RPGs in the way that it suddenly shifts into an entirely different game, which, unlike the elements of roleplay, is less freeform and bound to a rigid set of rules. I've always felt that combat is so abstracted from everything else in tabletop RPGs in the way that it suddenly shifts into an entirely different game, which, unlike the elements of roleplay, is less freeform and bound to a rigid set of rules. You're no longer interested in how things look, feel, or act, but rather how large a number on a sheet of paper is, and this contention of mine seems to always be translated into the video game counterpart of its genre, carrying the same problems from one medium to another. Games even seem to compound upon this issue by putting you in charge of multiple characters, whereas your custom-created character is somehow not only equal to them, but at the same time the savior of the universe and all that is holy. I cannot help but believe that the party ought to be AI-controlled pawns, considering that they're supposed to be different people with their own goals and aspirations, thus leaving it to the player to micromanage their singular character, their avatar in the game world, rather than developing a form of psychogenic schizophrenia by having to deal with each and every one of the party members. Now, admittedly, the remakes of both Baldur's Gate games have such a feature, but the combat AI is so poor that you still have to go and remind them that they actually have a whole list of spells that they could in fact be using. For instance, healing you as you sit there bleeding profusely, crippled and powerless on the ground. The only games which I have seen managing combat and RPG elements successfully are listed as a fundamentally different genre, known as immersive sim or 0451 games. To name a few, that will be games like those of the Deus Ex, Dishonored, or even the Fallout series. Most of these are first-person, for the most part shooters, with some emphasis on a singular character's development through dialogue and stat point distribution. My main point can be roughly exemplified by comparing the naming convention and the reality for both genres. One is a role-playing game, the other is an immersive simulation, The first being used deceptively, as you could be playing a multitude of roles at any given time, and also suspending that role play to participate in some rather lengthy tactical combat, for which could be 50% of the game's runtime. On the other hand, you have Immersive Sim, which according to Warren Spector, game designer of Deus Ex and Thief fame, is a game in which you are there, and nothing stands between you and the belief that you're in an alternate world. I simply cannot emphasize how even the most engaging narrative and the most skillful writing can be tarnished by the type of abstract combat which feels so fundamentally foreign and somehow still intrinsic to the idea of role-playing games and immersion. Disco Elysium seemed to be the odd one out, an RPG that has no combat except that initiated by your choices in dialogue, more akin to playing an animation than actual combat. It was also advertised to me as having quite an in-depth ideological system that was affected by your choices in-game and would automatically adapt dialogue according to your flavor of politics, philosophy, or culture through a series of thoughts, which you would internalize if used often enough. Frankly, it seemed like wish fulfillment for a jaded immersion-loving straight-edge centrist such as myself. Upon launching the game, I was quickly introduced to the persona that I would be inhabiting, a deranged, drunken amnesiac, who in some cases would pass as a cop, but only if one's notion of law-abiding is that of a drug-fueled abusive lover, also known as the farthest thing from me. I already knew that my journey through the game would be that of a redemption arc, where this horrible piece of shit human was going to become the most squeaky clean drug and alcohol-free centrist known to all of Revachol. A true test of the game's systems in action, from deranged and corrupt to the straight and narrow. To my eventual surprise, I could do all of it, and very successfully at that. By the end of my nearly 24-hour playthrough, I had achieved my ideal vision of the character, with only a few bits of resistance, which I would briefly mention further down the line. For now, I had succeeded in using all the tools available to me in order to internalize the thoughts for centrism, rejecting any form of drugs, and by the end almost managing to squeeze in the time to internalize being sober, cut too short due to the spontaneous conclusion of the game. The thought system was not entirely what I had initially imagined, namely, what it envisioned was a system which converts whatever responses one made throughout the game into non-internalized thoughts, which would begin to alter the dialogue options available, and only after choosing to emphasize said options would it eventually internalize and give you more radical lines of dialogue based on said thought. What it would turn out to do instead is make the acquisition of thoughts work in a similar manner, make the process of internalization a menu to equip thoughts into available slots. It seems like a minor inconvenience, but it makes the thoughts feel like yet another item that you just set and forget, rather than the thoughts of a person being actively developed over time based on what kind of discourse they engage in. I suppose the idea of having to take anywhere from 30 minutes to 6 hours to internalize is there to be the substitute for the drawn-out process of internalization. It is in a way saying, I feel like turning into a centrist in the next 30 minutes, while also going around doing investigative work around a crime scene. The more active process I had envisioned would indeed take a lot longer, but would be massively more immersive, as more and more options become available to you over time, rather than after some arbitrary timer has gone down. Another big detractor is having to use skill points to unlock new slots for thoughts, which would otherwise be put into your more practical skills. Theoretically, one would think a human has an almost infinite capacity for new ideas, and one is surely not going to want to internalize them all. A good example would be the volumetric shit compressor thought you gain early into the game, which mainly fulfills its purpose in one skill check for less physically able characters as a part of a single quest, and is never made use of again, beyond its flat stat bonuses of course. No other thought in my playthrough had a temporary pragmatic function like this, which feels like a missed opportunity. Its temporary nature is where the skill point cost seems absurd, when they could just be used to improve one's skills. In what way would the character becoming more skillful help them stop getting their shit together? Wouldn't one discard the thought immediately after it's no longer useful? The way the system works currently meant that I'd spend most of my points on slots and playing around with thoughts rather than improving my character until the very last parts of the game, which in effect made the game more difficult than intended. The decision to make thoughts equipable and not persistent passive perks that can upgrade into more radical or complete versions of themselves is perhaps one of my main disappointments with the game. The effect on scope would be minimal, as the game already has the dialogue for these options written, and would only need to change their acquisition internalization to be less menu-driven and more player-driven. I tangentially mentioned not having skill points to freely use until the latter parts of the game. This in turn made skill checks a lot more difficult and perilous by making white skill checks, ones that you can fail and retry by increasing the skill they require, harder to re-unlock once failed, and making red checks, ones that cannot be retried once failed, almost impossible, if not clothed in every stat-boosting piece of apparel in one's inventory, or seasoned with every potentially hazardous bottle of booze or glowing fairy dust left laying on the ground. White checks also do not unlock after one has used a consumable item or changed a piece of clothing to boost said stat, which encourages saves coming, as there is no way to change clothing in the middle of dialogue or knowing what the skill check will be, leading to one of the many pitfalls which I described earlier. An even greater fault is that some quests just drop dead in their tracks if the stat check is not completed. Moreover, since one cannot be proficient in all 4 skill categories, I would regularly hit a brick wall upon being faced with a psyche or physique skill check, as my character mainly focused in intellect and motorics. The thing about hitting a brick wall in Disco Elysium is not so much that you fail and have to face the consequences, but rather cannot continue at all and the narrative stops dead in its tracks until you successfully complete the check. Sometimes quests are tied into each other, so not being able to progress in one of them means that you can progress in any of them. Suddenly, an entire quest chain can just be gone at the click of a button. It got to a point where I would prefer to hear that all my efforts were in vain, fucking everything up irreversibly, rather than having a white check get locked and sit there in my journal, waiting for me to miraculously gain 5 points in some sub-skill of physique. One way to fix this would be to have more obfuscated red checks and uncertain odds that lead to failure states. At least that will be more immersive than the current offerings, as one could live with the consequences rather than be left guessing what it could have been if one had significantly higher skills. This, however, could be difficult, as there is a dice roll to every skill. Not being skilled merely means that you have less of a chance of succeeding, or alternatively, a higher chance to fail and lock the skill check. The one thing that the game does great when it comes to skills is the addition of secret tasks. If one were to follow particular lines of inquiry, it would often lead to some skill check down the line becoming easier due to the things learned beforehand about the topic. This system rewards being thorough and attentive, and is perhaps the best feature of the game. However, observations made through the Shivers system, where orbs of information will show up contextually above the protagonist's head, revealing information about the environment or elaborating on something relevant, do not appear to factor in these skill checks. This often leads to reading something important when it pops up in the overworld, but upon engaging someone in conversation, one must often select benign lines of dialogue, acting like one hasn't made those observations to begin with. The dissonance is even more infuriating whenever Kim, your companion throughout the game, tells you that you are obviously wrong because he also made those observations, but unlike you, could talk about them. It would have been a lot more diegetic if there were dialogue options available for you to repeat the observations to Kim instead, perhaps as you talk to him in the overworld, a feature that is woefully underutilized and shows the same 5 or so options throughout the entire game, except whenever Kim wants to talk to you about something he deems relevant, an ability which you would think the player should have had as well. Speaking of the overworld, Disco Elysium does quite a lot with the small real estate of its map. For what feels like a small neighborhood, it packs tens of hours of content, a varied cast of characters, and a lot of places to explore. Walking around is encouraged by the game almost to a fault. At many points during the game, Kim will remark upon your seemingly absurd ability to run around without getting tired. There even comes a point when you are injured and you are told not to run to avoid further harming yourself. After about 20 hours, I realized that this was in order to signal to the player that if they run all over the place, trying to finish everything as quickly as possible, they would be left with a lot of extra time at the end of the day, which would have perhaps better spent looking into side quests or other optional activities. However, the walk speed is so woefully slow, and with the amount of backtracking one needs to do, means that you will be seeing the same places plenty of times, which only tempts you even further not to waste your precious time RP walking. The game has benches which you could use to pass the time, but they're only available whenever Kim is not with you, which is only during the night, meaning that you can't make any meaningful progress by resting on one, effectively making them worthless. That and the presence of time-gated tasks mean that you will most likely be trying to find ways to waste your time, prompting Kim to berate you even more for straying away from the main focus of the narrative, as he often does. If you're a fast reader, the game luckily fast-forwards time based on how many options you've selected, rather than real time. This is most apparent whenever you're save scumming and going through entire trees of dialogue that you've already read. And you will be reading a lot, as that is what you signed up for when you relinquish the combat system of your typical RPGs. A welcome change, I might add, as the dialogue is beautifully written and engaging for tens of hours. The end credits even thank Chris Avellone for what is probably him lending a bit of his Midas touch when it comes to games writing. However, there are of course flaws in the way Disco Elysium decides to portray some of its characters, and it's sometimes more interested in making political statements in a very one-note way that might shock some people, rather than what you would think are nuanced and fleshed-out personas. A large part of the cast is wearing a thick layer of existentialism, which they seem to flaunt upon every given opportunity. The same goes for characters who clearly exhibit some variety of political radicalism. You've got your racist nationalist, your bourgeois-eating communist, your fence-sitting centrist dubbed moralist, and a whole swath of colorful opinionated people from who you either interact with or endure. Everyone else is mostly pleasant to be around, if not a bit saddening, due to the overall melancholic way of life the people of Disco Elysium are forced to lead, influenced by factors that they alone cannot control, an overall sense of futility present in every turn. Most of them have quirks that help them cope with their predicament, which you can explore in full detail through in-depth dialogue trees, leading to some intriguing interactions and ultimately some interesting consequences down the line. Every line of dialogue seems to have a lot of those, which is surprising for a game that so haphazardly makes you select dumb questions for answers you already know. An example of that is the one occasion in which you use a particular brand of alcohol to boost pain threshold in order to open a certain mission-critical freezer, which towards the end of the game had Kim labeling me as someone who drinks on the job, even after becoming sober and internalizing the thought that removes all positive effects from alcohol, as well as the action leading to us receiving an item which we would later use to further the plot. Instead of as a one-off sacrifice of one's principles, it is seen as a major transgression that would only lead people into thinking of me as even more of a raging alcoholic, rather than someone who is trying to recover and get their shit together, as it were. A major part of the game's rhetoric is lost to those who don't have a dictionary that has been well tempered through copious forms of political jargon, coming from a varied selection of manifestos, academic personal analyses, and some more famous philosophical works from the last century. I would go as far to say that some of the statements the game presents are absolutely impenetrable when it comes to wording. I'll give you an example. Heartache is beautiful, but democracy is subtle. Incrementally, you begin to notice a change in the weather. When it snows, the flakes are softer when they stick to your worry-worn forehead. When it rains, the rain is warmer. Democracy is coming to the administrative region. The ideals of DeLorean humanism are reinstating themselves. How can they not? These are the ideals of the Coalition and the Moralist International. These guys are signal blue, and they are not only good, they are also powerful. What will it be like once their nuanced plans have been realized? If you immediately recognize that this was about centrism, then congratulations. You're a lot smarter than me and probably everyone else around you. For you, Disco Elysium is the perfect college-level textual experience for your Tuesday night 1960s poetry club. For the rest of humanity, it's a bunch of gibberish. Flowery prose and poetics are riddled everywhere, and you're never really sure what you're doing, what thoughts you're thinking, or what's happening to you. I mentioned briefly that the game tries to depict centrism as a form of moralism, a term which it prefers over the former. Even so, it presents centrism as less of an effort to hold multiple perspectives and act with a full and informed range of understanding, rather as the stereotypical fence-sitting argument, where no decision can be made now and progress can only be obtained through a slow, incremental process. Well, on the surface, it would seem so. As a self-proclaimed and passionate centrist, I cannot help but disagree with the outsider view that the game seems to be promoting, favoring critique of the right and an emphasis towards the left side of the political compass, making small but insignificant jabs towards both throughout. Contextually, the game developers Zom have displayed a clear favor of the political left in their public appearances, which may explain the somehow skewed perspective. While it'd be lovely to go on about the politics of ideology, it's better not to judge the contents of the game based on the developer's ideological affiliation, or rather on its own merits. Considering the amount of reading one needs to do, I would hesitantly say that Disco Elysium is part RPG, part choose-your-own-adventure visual novel. I say RPG because of the aforementioned brick walls and having progress in a way that no immersive sim ever would. There would be multiple ways to get the same information, which is sadly not a thing Disco Elysium does well. The sheer volume of the text is also a cause for some, well, I suppose, aesthetic concerns about the game. Graphically, the game is stunning with its unique painterly style, but it also values it over function, namely in having the UI serve little to no purpose, as Kim and your portraits take up the entire bottom left of the screen. At the same time, the dialogue panel is put on the far right side of the screen, even though 2/3 of it are spent zoomed into some 3D models doing their idle animations, instead of having the text front and center as the thing you'll be most likely looking for 90% of your time with the game. Other technical issues include shadows being displaced from where they should be, especially on stairs, as well as being incredibly jagged for a game that doesn't really have high hardware requirements, and very little real-time lighting. But all of that is frankly unintrusive compared to the cramps in your neck from looking to your right all the time. Every once in a while, you get to enjoy not having to read, as a select few scenes are entirely voice acted by a talented cast. I am unsure, however, of the production team behind the recordings, as they seem to sound as if recorded in home studios with different microphones and sound processors. Other than that, the quality and range of the performances is wonderful, especially since it's coming from some lesser-known actors in the industry. When it comes to sound, the game does a fantastic job of establishing a lot of varied soundscapes for an admittedly small plot of land. The music is ambient, droning, and subtle, in all the ways that make you want to not think about it, until you're sitting there listening to the soundtrack on your own time, remembering all the scenes that every piece of music has lifted from monotony. All of these tracks have this aging, somber tone to them, much like the world they're written for, making the music an unavoidable and essential part of the experience. As you walk the fields of Revachol, with the wind blowing and the small creek near you emitting a slight babble. The only downside is that the mixing of all these layers is often horribly unproportioned. Everything will be quiet until some random intercom plays 2 straight minutes of loud white noise into your ear. Those parts are few and far between, but still leave a surprisingly large impression for an otherwise spotless execution of Foley and ambience. Overall, Disco Elysium is a full package. While not necessarily the game that I'd hope it would be, it is still an enjoyable experience with an incredible main quest, memorable characters and side quests, elevated by wonderful sound design and fantastic ambient music, with writing that will be unparalleled for years to come. While it is not without its flaws, and some of them are quite major, it does what it set out to do with flying colors, and is sure to appeal to a lot of people who have been looking for an experience such as this. For me, however, it also represents a lot of squandered potential. It is by no means an ideal game, far from it, but I would still recommend you play through it for yourself, just to see where it takes you. It has a way of challenging you intellectually that not a lot of games can pull off, especially nowadays. It's an admirable endeavor in tackling difficult topics, whilst also spinning an intriguing narrative that keeps you invested until the very end. In the original release of this review in the written format on my blog, I gave this game a 7 out of 10. If you would like to know the criteria upon which I graded this, they are also available in my review score guide, which has been posted below in the description. I would personally like to thank Noah Colwell Gervais and Joseph Anderson for their many, many reviews of different video games that have inspired this series in general. I would also like to thank those of you watching, and I hope that you found at least some of this informative or interesting. If you would like to read more, I have more written reviews about different video games and movies available on my blog. More video reviews will be available in the future, so if you would like to see more of those, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for your consideration.